welcome all of you, and thank you all for being here tonight. Some of you don't know who I am. My name is Laurel Paley. I'm the current chair of Visual Media Arts Department here at LACC. And where is our former chair, Alex Wiesenfeld? She should be somewhere. She'll be down here in a minute. And it's her birthday, just so you know. And so,
you should point her out when she left.
Everyone should just break into something. Anyway, she'll be upset that I said that. So anyway, but first thing, I do want to thank you all for being here, and I do have some people that I do need to thank. Alex is one of them. I also want to thank our fabulous, excuse me, I'm off my notes, and this is dangerous if I get off my notes. I wanted to thank the people who have made this possible. First of all, we have a committee of people who work really hard to figure out some really great speakers, and I do believe Joe Potts and Eugene suggested Jeremiah Chiu to our committee. We have Elizabeth Prager and Tarina, who work really hard to make this event happen every week, or every other week. We have some really nice graphics, thanks to Ian Roberts. And he's our fabulous federal work study student who's working hard to make things look better around here. Yeah. How many of you are new here? This is the first time you've come to one of our lectures. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for coming. How many of you found out about this from professors? From professors? Any of you on our Instagram feed? You heard it on Instagram? A couple people. Great. If you don't know, it's lacc.vama, V-A-M-A, so please subscribe to our Instagram. Any of you found out from our new email blast? We started a new MailChimp email blast. Thank you, Tarina. Last session, the president of the college came because she got an email. So, go Tarina. So, however, and how many of you just saw the flyers and you went, oh, that sounds great, good, a few people, great. So thank you all again for being here. So I am really excited to have Jeremiah Chiu here. He is going to be introduced by Eugene Ahn. And how many of you heard Eugene Ahn, Professor Ahn's amazing lecture last week? Yeah, a few people. So like Professor Ahn, our lecturer is another interdisciplinary voice in the arts, but I do want Eugene to say more because you know him well. So Eugene Ahn, please take it away, and why don't you come and introduce Jeremiah Chiu.
Thank you. I defer my introduction to Joe Potts.
So a couple of you know me, but most of you don't. My name is Joe Potts. I teach the graphic design 1, 2, and 3 class here on Monday and Wednesday mornings. And this is my first year teaching here, so I'm excited to be here and have been enjoying the lecture series. And so, you know, one of the things that I was excited to do is sort of like help suggest people and bring people in. And a little while back, through another project that I do, it's called the Southland Institute, I met a person who I was having lunch with, and he said to me, he was like, oh, you have to talk to Jeremiah Chiu. He's amazing. I think you guys will really get along. You like his work. So, yeah, I think around that time, I got in touch with Jeremiah. We had lunch, talked about things, and I was like, oh, wow, the work is amazing. Sort of like all of these common interests in design and music and electronic music and synthesis. And yeah, so we just sort of like, we were talking, and then in the course of that conversation, I think Jeremiah was like, oh, do you know Eugene? And so in the way that these kind of worlds are very small and circles all kind of move back around, you know, it turned out that we all knew each other. And yeah, I thought that he would be a great fit to speak here. So I'm going to read this sort of official introduction of him, because my poor mind doesn't retain it all. So Jeremiah is a Los Angeles-based graphic designer, artist, and musician. From 2008 to 2016, Jeremiah served as co-founder and principal of Floral, an award-winning internationally recognized creative studio. Jeremiah's current practice, Some All None, is an extension of the practice he founded at Plural, focused on merging art, music, and technology into new hybrid forms. Additionally, Jeremiah collaborates as part of the InfoCo team, which is formerly Project Projects, and is a resident DJ at DubLab. Most recently, Jeremiah has led workshops at Art Center College of Design and DePaul University, composed a graphic score for player piano at the Getty Center, and released a cassette book, LP of new music and art. So we're very lucky to have Jeremiah here to talk to us tonight. And yeah, I think I will give it over to him. If you could give him a very warm welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I want to thank Joe for inviting me, and Eugene, as well as everyone that's helped contribute and put this all together. It's really a pleasure to be here speaking to everybody. So I'm here to just talk a little bit about my practice and my work, all which sort of lives under the guise of this studio called Some All None. And basically the way that I'll sort of go through this today is I'll share sort of a breadth of projects, and we'll kind of go through a lot of different projects and a lot of different slides. You can see and get a good sense of the work that I do, because it sort of lives in a few different trajectories. But then we'll follow that up with a portion of time which we can do questions, and I can answer anything that anyone wants to discuss, and can even go back through in more detail. But yeah, as Joe had mentioned, so I do a couple different things here. Some All None being the primary studio that I'm focused on, creating sort of my own practice and my own works on. That was founded out of a studio called Plural, which was in Chicago and existed from 2008 until 2016. So I've been here in LA for about 5 years, and then sort of evolved that studio or that practice into Some All None. Additionally, I work as a designer on part of the InfoCo team, which was formerly Project Projects, and now they are here in LA, and they've been here for about 1.5 years, as well as being a resident DJ at DubLab, which is also just down the street here. So a little bit of what I'll sort of share are these projects that kind of live in these different spheres. Primarily, the practice that I have was rooted and founded in studying graphic design. So I think sort of the easiest way to conceptualize, or the starting point is graphic design. And thinking about a studio that I formed and the way that I work, I work traditionally in graphic design by executing different types of projects, from digital apps to identity systems to interactive design, installations, and things that you generally would associate with a graphic design studio or practice. Additionally, I sort of have a second counterpart to the practice, which is what I call art and synthesis. And I use the word synthesis instead of music because I primarily work with synthesizers. And I really think about the idea of, or my approach to music as one act of synthesizing. And within those realms, I create things that you can think of as like albums, artwork, collaborations, exhibitions, lectures, installations, and sort of all of that sort of realm. So with these two sort of facets of my practice, I really look always at the opportunities in which these can collectively sort of form a hybrid practice or form something that feels unique to my approach or my philosophy in design, art, and music. And always looking at something sort of visually and saying, like, maybe a better way to describe this is graphic art and design synthesis. And this may not sort of make perfect logical sense, but I think visually it starts to bring these two ideas together. The same way in functioning as a sort of design studio and an art practice, I look at those kind of silos and see what ways you can collapse them together to also create hybrid forms and new experiences. And that's really a lot of what my practice is rooted in, is this idea of how do we create new expressions, new hybrid forms from the understanding in different fields and different sort of practices. The majority of the work that I do is within these three realms, overlapping a lot of projects with other artists in collaboration, educational institutions, and cultural institutions. And that same practice is really always considering these sort of facets, the overlap of theory, experimentation, and practice in the realms of art and music and design. And when I even look at this sort of diagram, this kind of like Venn diagram and the way things overlap, I think of it a little bit less of, you know, what's the sort of center point or the moments that two or three parts overlap, and more about the translation between the three of them. So this is sort of more of a fluid, oscillating world. And so the different parts of the practice that I'll share today are these three sort of overlapping, from form to concept, and then something I'm going to call translation. And I'll sort of break down different projects within these realms so we can get a good understanding of different types of projects that I'll share. So I wanted to start with just some of the most recent work I did as part of the InfoCo team, because it's an exhibition that I spent the past few months working on. That was called Dimensions of Citizenship. And basically what this was is I was the lead exhibition graphics as part of the team that included, you know, exhibition design, strategy, you know, a bunch of different counterparts of the overall exhibition. And this was a basically identity system and exhibition design for the U.S. pavilion that was at the Venice Architecture Biennale in Venice, Italy in last summer, basically in 2018. And that show basically had run its course from May to November in Venice, and then was recently adapted to a space in Chicago called Brightwood 659. And so there was kind of like this re-adaptation of the same exhibition. And basically this exhibition was curated by three curators, Mimi Zeiger, Anne Louis, and Neil Atkinson, in collaboration with the associate curator, Iker Gill. This was a collaboration between the University of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. And this is basically an image of the exhibition space, the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And so this idea, Dimensions of Citizenship, it was an exhibition that was focused on basically what does it mean to be a citizen, and sort of how do we live and act and exist as citizens within architectural spaces, and sort of what is the understanding of architecture in relationship to citizenship. And they presented this through seven different scales, from the citizen to the city scale, to the region, to the nation, globe, network, and cosmos. So it's sort of this like powers of 10 scale relationship of understanding what it means to be a citizen today. This is always like a fun image to share for me, because this was one of the more challenging parts of that exhibition, which was basically doing like a vinyl graphic mapped onto like a 3D globe, which you can kind of see the exterior of at the center of this, which just took quite a bit of time to map out how something would go from 2D to 3D and seamlessly sort of apply without knowing exactly what those measurements are. So we were really counting on that dome to be perfectly a sphere. And I'll just kind of take you through, this is the Venice exhibition and the different spaces in the pavilion. And in addition to the exhibition design, we also produced the catalog, the gallery guide, and some of the other collateral that was supplementary to the exhibition itself. The gallery guide, you can see sort of like the two piles flanking the catalog here, have this pop out in the center of the cover that you could just kind of take out and then form a dome or globe itself. And then this is just an image of the catalog. And then this is basically how it has been adapted to a new space in Chicago. And so this basically opened 2 weeks ago and is open until the end of April. And you can kind of see the very different types of spaces that it had to be adapted to. But it was a great exercise in seeing how we can bring a lot of these materials over, what things are going to have to be translated, and sort of how we continue the exhibition and the expression of these works in a new space. Oh, and this is just an image from one of the curators that had shared with me. Basically somebody that just needed to get that globe and did not want the rest of the gallery back. But I always love these images when you see sort of the work that you're producing or working on for months at a time live in this context. And then you say, like, does it still work? And does it still, how does it appear? And how does it live in this context? So they're my favorite images to see all of this. So now I'll talk about some of the projects to give you a good sense of what I do in my personal studio and practice as some alumni. I focus a lot on doing identities, mostly with different institutions, as I mentioned, cultural and not and educational and artists. And this is basically like an identity for a restaurant in Chicago, and you'll kind of see a lot of different Chicago and LA-based projects because a lot of my practice and relationships were from connections in Chicago. This is an architecture studio in Chicago. This is a sort of a Korean-American fashion line here in LA. This is an album artwork for an artist that, basically this was the first quadraphonic record that was produced in, I think, 30 some years, and I got to collaborate on the packaging for it. This is just an identity and website for a gallery space in Chicago. This is basically a billboard for Dublab, who is the internet / FM radio station here in LA, and this was their 19th anniversary. And then another radio station in Chicago called Lumpen Radio, and you'll kind of see a few different projects that oscillate around these worlds of Lumpen and Lumpen Radio and the magazine that I'll share. So I've been doing quite a bit of work for them for over a decade. So I'll talk through Lumpen magazine in terms of it as an example of form, and I think it'll give a good sort of understanding of the way that I approach design or design systems, but also sort of music and art projects through sort of both a formal lens, a conceptual lens, and then how those things can all meet together. So Lumpen magazine is a free publication, which I actually have a stack up here that you can take as you leave. And if you need more, I'm happy to send Eugene back with more. But basically, this is what it looked like, and it had been in Chicago and for quite some time. It's currently in its 27th year of being produced, and basically it's a culture, arts, politics magazine, and it has all of these different things that may not always sort of come together in a traditional publication, but they are certainly met together here in this publication. And it basically is a free publication that you can find sort of in your local bookstore, art spaces, and different things like that. And basically the editor and sort of founder or creator of this, Ed Marzuski, approached me 12 years ago now, I think, 10 years ago, somewhere in that range. And basically, like, this is what it looked like, and he said, I want to give this thing a new life. I want to reapproach this magazine. We kind of evolve this every so many years. How can we look at Lumpen and basically revamp it, make it a different scale, and really start to think about what the content is and bring that a little bit more forward. And so I said, this is a great project. I'm happy to work on it. What's your time frame? And how long can we sort of produce this magazine and rethink about the redesign of this, and he said, "Can you do it in a week?" I was just like, that's insanity. But in a lot of ways, well, I'll just let you know, it happened in a week, and in a lot of ways, that project has, over the course of its life, been one of the most sort of fun and engaging projects, because what it allows me to do when I'm working on sort of other projects similar, a different publication or a different magazine that may take 3 or 6 months or even multiple years to do, when you're doing this one and you have a week, and so it really forces me to approach it always by saying, like, I can't overthink this. I just have to execute this. So what's going to be a system that I can develop that's going to allow this to continue to evolve, allow it to be dynamic, and allow it to have an expression that's engaging and complementary to the content that's within it. So initially, the identity redesign, we sort of created this logo, and this was at Plural in partnership with the collaborators that I was working with there. We really tried to think about the identity, saying, like, how does this mark that we see here how can we evolve that and start to capture something of what it feels a little bit more like when you read this or experience it. So something that maybe has many different parts that kind of come together irregularly, but they sort of cohere in an interesting way. And so that ended up being this initial magazine. And from that, this is basically what has been consistent over the course of the past 10 years that I've been doing this, is basically this grid, which is the foundation for a spread of that magazine, and basically saying, like, this is what we can do, is establish some baseline framework or structure, which then anything that happens within this goes. And that can really allow anyone that's working on it or anyone designing it to be very expressive, but then to have some sort of commonality within it. And I'm focusing always on the content and reading through this and saying, like, how can we then be expressive with the way that layout is sort of put to paper, put to page, and goes from page to page. So we really are always looking at the page layout as these sort of formal compositions. And saying, within that system, how many different ways can we be expressive? And look at different approaches to laying or doing, some basic typesetting from page to page, from issue to issue, year to year. And this is kind of how they lay out. So the magazine has continued to evolve, and I'll just share some covers here. And these were sort of the first few ones that we had done together. This is the 20th anniversary where we had mashed up 20-some years of different covers and kind of decided that whatever happens there is the right thing. And then in the 25th year, we started to think about how I can approach the cover and give it more space and even actually reduce the sort of space that the masthead would take up, because this magazine isn't something that sits on like a magazine stand or a newsstand, so it doesn't have to function in the traditional way that that has to adhere to like the way that a masthead would function. So it didn't have to read like that, which gave us the opportunity to really say, look, let's just utilize the entirety of the cover, think about ways that we can collaborate, invite different artists, and contribute to creating just a little bit more of a unique cover per issue. And then you'll see that we continue to evolve it here as these continue forward. Now we're doing a lot more distribution in New York and Los Angeles as well, so it felt also like a right time to keep on evolving this publication to include more content and more work in that's sort of a little bit more international focused than Chicago-centric. So I'll take you through a couple of projects that focus now a little bit more on the way that I think through ideas in any project and the way that I'll take sort of a prompt and a collaboration with the client through a concept. And I really like to think about this as a conceptual approach, much more so than an aesthetic agenda. So like myself as a sort of artist or a designer or somebody practicing, like I don't have a huge, I don't have this huge desire that I need to make something a certain way, but I actually find that in my practice and my work, it's really about seeking out those moments that I'm following a path or I'm following a journey and I don't really know where it's going to end. And it allows me to discover a lot more potential expressions and approaches that I may not have come to had I had more of like a specific idea in the onset of any project. So this project it's a beer called Lump and Boogie, and so basically this is a collaboration. The guy, Adam Marzuski, he also runs a brewery called Mars Brewing, and this is kind of basically a beer label design that he had asked me to create. He said, like, do what you can do. It's fundraising. We're going to make it. It's a special sort of beer. Do whatever you want to do. And so when I was thinking about the can itself and the way to approach a label, there was so many different approaches that I could say, like, let's celebrate this. Let's add this content. Let's do this thing and think about how we can just like put all the words on there. But really I wanted to start to ask that question, what is a can? What is this object and what is a label? And that philosophy and that sort of approach is always one that I ask. And it's something that people always sort of joke with me about when I'm talking about the work that know me, because this is always the question I'll ask at the onset of any project. Let's collaborate on a business card. Let's collaborate on a calendar or an identity. And my question is, but what is a calendar? What is an identity? And in this case, what is a can? And I really like to think about this question as always the starting point, because it allows me to leave any preconceived ideas of what I want to do, but allows me to just start back at that very beginning point and say, like, what is there? And I literally always start just by looking up the definition, because I think what that does is it allows me to see how, at a very base understanding, I can find moments to go from. So, a can it's a metal container, but it also has this slang in language. I think that's what's really interesting. It can be a toilet or a prison. You can be in the can. But as a word or verb, can is something that's an action. You can do something or you're allowed to do something. And I think that sort of idea right there for me is like, all right, we have some trajectories to follow, and this starts to look at different ways that a can have different potential. Same thing with beer. We're looking at beer and saying, like, well, this is just like it's an alcoholic beverage in this can. So now we have like a liquid in a cylinder, in a metal cylinder, and like that's kind of what I'm working from. But I also look at the formal qualities of the can itself and say, what are we doing by adding a label to this object? What are we doing? How do we interact with it, and what's my relationship to this object? So a can, it can stand, it can roll, it can be upside down and stand as well, but it also really is just kind of like these two cylinders with sides. And usually it comes in these packs. In this case, it was sort of like a 4-pack or 6 or 12. But this allows me to start to see that they often appear in groups. I think for this particular project, this was a moment in which I said, this is really interesting. Cans stack. What can I do to explore these different trajectories and find something? What else stacks, or what else can I discover from that? And so what I ended up doing with this was creating a label that when you basically think about the form of an exquisite corpse, in which you can stack, different images that link together in different ways, and you sort of like have different people collaborating to create a cohesive image. I wanted this can to have that similar feeling, where if you were presented with a pack of these cans and you stack them in any fashion, could you create a way in which the artwork would always line up, no matter how many, no matter how few, and no matter what order they're in? And so really it was just trying to think about how you can create an artwork that then lines up in many different ways, even if you're turning the can or stacking the can. And then these were presented in this sort of like boombox looking case because it was a fundraiser for a radio station. So one other can, basically continuing on this, as soon as I was asked to do another can, the first thought was like looking back at that 4-pack of cans and saying like, this is going to come in a case of 4-packs. Can I create something that uses the can as an instrument? Can I create a score, sort of like a graphic score that can be interpreted in any different ways that allows 4 people to take each one can and turn this into like a drum that produces sound, and you can kind of like play a score with it. So, as a way to look at this and say, what's a different approach with the same object, and just having sort of a prompt to like make a label for this. With identity systems, I'm oftentimes collaborating with an institution or a small business and developing an identity that's sort of representing them or their, what they do through a mark, a set of typography, a color palette, and image handling. So identity, I started to think a lot more about my approach in identity systems as a typographic one, and one that develops a typographic system, because so much of the way that you encounter any entity or institution is through its language and the tone and the form. So you have this visual vocabulary that things come through. And the question I was always asking is, if you were only to see a sentence, would you know who said it? And so I think of identity oftentimes this way, because it's this all these different counterparts of saying, like, you'll see, marketing copy, or the way something is written, and then the logo mark. But like, if you were to remove the logo, would you still understand who this comes from? So the approach to identity systems and thinking is one in which I try to always bring those counterparts together and say, if you were only to see the words, does it have a life? Does it have an expression that's unique to itself? With the project MDW Fair, or Midway Fair, this is basically a identity for an art fair that was in Chicago that was basically set for everything in between. So not only did it exist in the Midwest, but it was everything from alternative DIY spaces to large cultural institutions. So that was really the idea of this like midway and in between. The identity system that was created was based on this mark, but really was starting to say, from that mark on the bottom left side, can we create a system in which anything goes within the bounds of that? So if I only use the top, only use the bottom, or only use the full form, and combine all of those, can that start to create a life that has a unique sort of language? And so that was basically the system for the identity, was thinking about, here's 4 alphabets, you can combine them any different way you want, and that's going to be the primary identity for this. Also thinking about, like, how can this then expand and evolve for future years? And so if there was another fair the subsequent year, how would that expression come to? And so for that, I'll show you basically. The same system was then adopted, but it was basically a different application for color. And so you have that same type system, and they focus really this year only on using one part of the form, but saying here's a different color palette, we're not using images anymore with it. So it starts to have an evolution, but still exists within that same family. Oh yeah, and then here's my pictures of encountering the work at the fair. So this was a great one to see, it did an amazing job holding the door open. And then it provided some great reading material as well in the Porta-Johns. For the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, they had a 150th anniversary in 2016, and was approached to create the mark and basically the identity system to represent 150 years of art, culture, art making, and sort of like art education in this identity system. And so that was really a challenging prompt and a challenging thing to think through, was how are we going to capture all of this, 150 years into a single approach. And through that, we started to basically develop two trajectories. One, to say, let's just look at these ideas. We can always think about the course of 150 years of an art institution as something that's always changing, always evolving. But we can also think about the way that we look at or engage with art as seeing more than one way. So positive and negative, or are there many different ways in which I can actually see something and understand it. Within that context, we started to look at all the different potential explorations and expressions that something like, always changing would look, or always, basically seeing two ways would look. And you kind of look at these pathways to start to say, what are the moments that I want to explore deeper? And the diagram that sort of like that explains this process is always one of basically opening and closing. So it kind of looks like a diamond shape, where you have an idea, you open it up to as many possibilities, you look at those and you find something to hone in on, and then you bring those back into a single point. And then you kind of just keep doing this opening and closing until you feel like you've discovered a solution that's functioning. So the solution for this identity was basically to think about the spirit of SAIC, the School of the Art Institute. It's this energy that connects the past, the present, and the future to the city of Chicago and the community, both in the arts and the sort of larger cultural community. So the typeface and the type design, and also the system, we really wanted to think about this as being a shared canvas, this open framework where tradition meets tradition making. So there's not any one way to define this, but there's infinite ways to express this. And I'll just share this video. Let's see if I can find my mouse. That explains that. And so basically the solution was, instead of giving them a single logo mark, we gave them a software platform that was basically like a web page in which you can go in and type as many, any words that you wanted to, but then you can adjust all the variables of the identity and output basically infinite logo marks or infinite typographic expressions. And this is just an example of the web platform. So it basically looked like this. You would come to the page and you could press all the different buttons, adjusting color, adjusting thickness and stroke. And then there was this button at the bottom right-hand side that says randomize, and that would basically take all of those variables and switch them. So what that allowed you to do was have a system that can go from something that's hyper legible and hyper straightforward to something that's super abstract and totally unlegible. Sound was basically just for this video. It was something they had created, because really that idea of creating a synthesizer that has these parameters was one in the such to explain that idea. And so there basically was a gallery that students, faculty, staff could all go onto the page and make their own thing and then contribute to the gallery. Of course, when you leave something open to that, I thought it was really great that they were open to the fact that they knew that this was going to be filled with, profanities and inappropriate things in combination with like really beautiful abstractions. And so here are just a couple of those expressions as they existed throughout the city. Similarly, for the Logan Center in Chicago, which is basically Logan Center Exhibitions is the gallery that's within the Logan Center at the University of Chicago. I created the identity for the exhibition space itself, which was looking at the same idea that I just explained, where on the left here you'll see this is the Logan Center logo or mark that they had. And so basically, rather than creating an entirely new system from that, I started to say, what can we do that's already there, what can we pull from and discover that's going to extend or evolve the language and the tone of the existing identity for the rest of the institution that exists there. The exhibition space itself really stands for these sort of two things. So it's this platform or this space for discourse, for artists, for dialogue, and then it was also really thinking about the way that it frames these artists through the curatorial practice, through the expressions that the curator brings in and through. And so from that logo mark and logo type, I basically used that to create an entire alphabet, which they could then use for all of the applications in the system. And here are just a couple of these examples as well. And so it's once again looking at that question of, if I was to see only the language here, could I get a sense of where this is coming from? And does it have a sort of unique voice, both through the way the language is written and the visual expression that it contains? This is one last identity I'll share, which is Open Arts and Music Festival, which is here in Glendale, California. And I believe that it's now in its 4th year. And it was the same approach of looking at, like, how can we create an identity system that's going to support and be the visual expression for this arts and music festival. Glendale, as people may or may not know, here is made up of many different communities. So there's all these sort of different cultural touch points within that community, which is, you know, the Armenian community, the Korean, Filipino, Latino, and Caucasian sort of communities all exist collectively and together in the city of Glendale. So really it was looking at how can we start to activate all these different touch points and sort of ideas, in addition to combining that with something like, well, this is an arts and music festival, and how are just simply the arts and music oftentimes visualized? What's that overlap of those two things as well? So looking at all these different sort of pieces, we started to say, like, let's discover these expressions. So we wanted to look at everything from like the traditional sort of folk textile patterns that existed within these different cultures and their communities, as well as the typography and the language that existed from all the different communities, and create a symbol set, create sort of like this visual language that we can then pull from and distill into something that feels uniquely like their identity and visual vocabulary. So from all these sort of simplified marks and symbols that came from the textiles and the language, started to break that down into all the different counterpoints or pieces that would form an alphabet. And so that's kind of what we see here is this transition from symbol to form, for a letter form, basically. And then this was that expression of creating an alphabet based on those symbols and forms. But then feels like it's activated in a specific way that comes from the communities that exist within Glendale. And so that resulted in this mark. And then here are just some of these expressions. And then, as you'll see also with these opportunities to activate the identity in a sort of dynamic or animated or in motion realms, that's always also where I start to think about not only how does this visual form or vocabulary appear, but how does it also sound? So what do these words sound like, and what are these, oops, my mouse has to be in the middle. I'll find it. There, I'll just go that. So really only using the type itself, we're able to create this animation for the Arts and Music Festival. So that brings us to translation, and I think that, you saw in the last two projects that I shared, or rather the synthesizer project and the most recent one with Open Arts, this idea of like starting to see also how things sound. And I think because my, the other parts of my practice focus so much on synthesis and music, I'm always looking at ways that those, the way that I understand both of those languages overlap. And so for me, there's already this inherent overlap between composing something in music and composing something on, say, a poster. You're always looking at those same formal qualities of rhythm, balance, contrast, etc. And so for me, there was always this very direct link between the way you hear something, the way you see something, the way something sounds, and the way it looks.